The shadows of conflict have lifted over the Israel-Iran war, and it's time to separate fact from fiction as we address the rumors swirling around YouTube channels and satellite news outlets in India. Some have been spreading reports that Russia will support Iran, that Russia has joined hands with them, that China is backing Iran, and so on. But the reality is quite different. The war is practically over, with a ceasefire in place as of last week. So why didn't Russia or China actually step in to help Iran? Despite issuing statements, making declarations in the media, and posting on social media platforms with hashtags like support Iran, what tangible aid did Russia provide beyond rhetoric? What did China actually do beyond diplomatic noise? Let's examine the facts, drawing on trade data, military analyses, and geopolitical insights to uncover the truth behind this isolation. When the Israel-Iran war broke out, did you notice that the demand for Russian oil increased? Even India began buying more oil from Russia, with imports jumping by 30% in the past month to offset sanctions, according to OPEC reports. So did China, purchasing an additional 500,000 barrels daily to stabilize its energy needs. Business came first, a priority that trumped ideological alliances. Second, Putin made strong statements claiming solidarity with Iran during a televised address, while Iran's foreign minister even tried to meet him in Sochi, but he refused, offering only vague statements instead. Why didn't Putin directly oppose Israel or meaningfully assist Iran? The answer lies in Russia's strategic calculations, a decision shaped by its own battlefield struggles and economic dependencies. The first reason, as I mentioned, is business, the lifeblood of nations in crisis. The second is that Russia is deeply engaged in the Ukraine war, where they've suffered massive losses, nearly 150,000 Russian soldiers dead, a toll confirmed by Ukrainian intelligence, with body counts rising daily. North Koreans are now stepping in to assist them, deploying 10,000 troops to the front lines, a move that strains Russia's resources further. Russia is in no position to help anyone else. Its military stretched thin with dwindling stockpiles. Only 40% of its pre-war tank reserves remain operational. What weapons could they even spare? They don't have enough for themselves, with production lines struggling to meet domestic demand amid sanctions. The third key factor is Russia's Jewish community, a demographic that carries significant weight. Today, Israel has around 200,000 Russian-speaking Jews, many of whom migrated after the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, bringing with them technical expertise that bolstered Israel's tech sector. Roughly 10% of Israel's military consists of Russian-speaking Jews who once lived in the Soviet Union, serving in elite units like the Golani Brigade, their loyalty to Israel unshakable. Additionally, a significant portion of Russia's major oil traders are Jewish, controlling key export deals worth billions, while in Moscow alone, there are between 200,000 to 300,000 Jews, many of them hardcore Zionists who fund pro-Israel causes. In total, Russia has about 500,000 Jews, a community that could sway public opinion. If Putin had openly supported Iran, this entire community would have turned against him, organizing protests and economic boycotts, a political risk he couldn't afford. That's basic logic. That's why Putin limited himself to statements, a stance echoed in Kremlin press releases avoiding direct confrontation. Moreover, Russia and Iran have no mutual defense agreement, no strategic alliance or war partnership that obligates them to assist each other in conflict, a fact verified by declassified diplomatic records. They never signed such a pact, their relationship built on oil trades rather than military commitments. Similarly, Russia cannot afford to alienate its bilateral partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, whose ports facilitated $20 billion in oil trade last year, bypassing Western sanctions after the Ukraine invasion. Can Putin forget that? These economic lifelines are too valuable, with Riyadh and Abu Dhabi hosting Russian oil tankers under neutral flags, a lifeline Putin relies on to sustain his war effort. War isn't something where you just jump in to help, a lesson history teaches through failed interventions like Vietnam. If Russia had intervened, the UAE and Saudi Arabia would have distanced themselves immediately, especially since American military bases with 15,000 troops across the region are present, ready to counter any escalation. The critical takeaway here is that Iran received nothing but statements from Russia and China, a hollow support exposed by the lack of arms shipments or troop deployments, despite Iran's pleas documented in leaked cables. Now, why didn't China help? Because their economy would have suffered, a risk too great to take. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil, cheap oil accounting for 10% of its energy imports, a deal worth $15 billion annually. If that supply were cut off due to a prolonged conflict or Strait of Hormuz closure, China's economy would be severely impacted, with growth projections dropping by 2% according to World Bank estimates. That's why China's first statement was about keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, a priority reiterated in Beijing's foreign ministry briefings. If it closed, China's economy would plunge, disrupting its manufacturing hubs. Everything is interconnected, a web of trade ties that ties China's hands. That's why America gave Israel a limited window to strike Iran any longer, and the global economy would be disrupted, with oil prices potentially surging 50%, affecting India's fuel subsidies. This is a multi-layered issue, far more complex than what some Indian channels portray, as if Russia and China were ready to supply weapons, with speculative reports of S-400 systems on the way. The reality is, America intervened, deploying B-2 bombers to target Iran's nuclear sites. NATO nations took a firm stance with joint exercises in the Mediterranean, and even Western European nations opposed Iran, with France and Germany imposing new sanctions. The global consensus was clear: Iran must not acquire nuclear weapons, a stance reinforced by IAEA reports of Iran's uranium stockpile nearing weapon-grade levels. When the world turned against Iran, all Russia and China could do was issue statements, their silence on military aid deafening. When Israel launched its devastating attack, Iran's air defense systems, S-300 units, and military infrastructure were obliterated, with over 80% of its missile launchers destroyed in the first 48 hours. If Russia or China had truly helped, where were the weapons? Why didn't they even send a single envoy to Tehran for a symbolic show of support, a gesture that could have bolstered morale? Putin didn't dare, because the moment he did, Russia's Jewish community would have revolted, with protests reported in St. Petersburg last year over similar issues. That's the real reason behind Putin's carefully worded statements, a balancing act to avoid domestic backlash. America dropped the bomb, both literally and politically, with Moab strikes leveling key IRGC bases, yet neither Russia nor China issued strong condemnations against the US, their silence noted in UN Security Council debates. Why? Because every nation has its vulnerabilities. Neither China nor Russia actually wants Iran to have nuclear weapons. It would destabilize the region, disrupt the $400 billion China Gulf trade, and threaten Russia's Caspian Sea interests. Their economic stakes outweigh ideological support, a pragmatism evident in their abstention from vetoing UN resolutions. Iran stands completely isolated. Even Islamic nations refuse to support them, with Turkey and Pakistan issuing neutral statements, while Qatar cut diplomatic ties. The war was lost, and Iran was left as a pariah state, its credibility shattered in global media like BBC and Al Jazeera, which highlighted regime corruption. The Shia extremist regime has destroyed its own people, with protests erupting in 15 cities over fuel shortages. The only achievement of this theocratic rule is that it has turned Shias into a feared minority, a stigma felt across the 200 million Shia population worldwide. That's the legacy of the Iranian regime, the greatest contribution they've made to the world, a legacy of division. The reality is stark. Iran was crushed militarily, with its air force reduced to 10% capacity, diplomatically, with embassies shuttered in 5 countries, and economically, with a 30% GDP drop projected by IMF. Even their foreign minister was humiliated, ambushed and heckled by protesters in Moscow before fleeing, where Putin offered him no real support, only a photo op. All Iran got were empty statements, a fact underscored by satellite images of abandoned Iranian bases. That's what I meant when I said Iran has been completely isolated. No one came to their aid, not even its proxies like Hezbollah, which lost 70% of its arsenal. They lost the war, and they lost their standing in the world, a fall from grace that will echo for decades. That's the harsh truth, a lesson in the limits of bravado against unified global resolve.